Good evening. I'm Parveen Yaqub. I'm Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Research and Innovation here at the university. I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to you all, whether you're regulars or this is your first time. I'm delighted to be presenting the first in this year's public lecture series, Climate Change, Turning Up the Heat on Health. Now, I hardly need to say that climate change is at the forefront of global attention, not least because of a global movement of climate strikes started by a 15-year-old girl who demanded action from world leaders. I'm sure there's not a single person in the room who isn't aware that rising temperatures due to climate change have caused fires in the US and elsewhere, have led vulnerable people being directly affected by heat waves, and have resulted in vulnerable societies with weak infrastructure, lacking the resilience to respond to extreme events. Climate change affects the social and environmental determinants of health that we take for granted. Clean air, safe drinking water, sufficient food, and secure shelter. Today's lecture will explore the impact of climate change on our health over time and the health benefits of the world's efforts to reduce climate change. It will be delivered by Elizabeth Robinson, Professor of Environmental Economics, who's based in the School of Agriculture, Policy and Development. Liz graduated with a first-class degree in Engineering, Economics and Management from the University of Oxford, and subsequently a PhD in Applied Economics from Stanford University in the USA. She has over 25 years' experience working in lower-income countries, including 6 years living in Tanzania and Ghana, where her research influenced agricultural and environmental policy to improve the livelihoods of resource-dependent communities. Her current focus is on exposure and vulnerability to climate change, especially with regard to food security and food systems, topics on which she's spoken about widely in the media. Now, before I hand over to our speaker, I'd just like to point out that we will be filming today's lecture and we'll be uploading both the lecture and the Q&A session on our YouTube pages. So if you have any questions or issues about that, please make yourself known to the helpers. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Elizabeth Robinson.
Putting my timer on so I don't talk too long. Thank you so much, Parveen, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for coming out on this starting to get chilly evening to listen to this talk on climate change and health. So, where to start? I think before I start the talk proper, what I'd like you to do is to think to yourselves, what does the climate crisis look like? And so have a mental picture of what it looks like to you. You might want to close your eyes. You might not. But think about what the climate crisis looks like. And so maybe, I have to give you time to think first. Maybe some of you in the audience are thinking of a polar bear, because when we look at the media, when we've heard a lot of people talk about climate change, often this or a similar polar bear is used. And we understand that. The planet is getting warmer, sea rise, we're seeing sea rise, we're seeing polar ice melting. And we're being encouraged to be concerned about wildlife. As Parveen mentioned, maybe some of you have this image. This is the most recent youth strike. And this was one where the grown-ups were invited to come along, so I went along too to see what was going on there, and it was quite inspirational. Some of you might be thinking about Extinction Rebellion and their current protests. But increasingly, we're realizing that the reality is that climate crisis is always also looking like this, a myriad of health problems, chronic asthma, heart problems, malaria, dengue, and Parveen also mentioned some of those other problems. And so climate change is at last, I think, being increasingly recognized as a public health emergency. And so today what I want to talk to you about is the links between climate change and public health and explain them a little bit. I want to show some of the evidence. And I'm going to say this now that sometimes when you talk about climate change, the message seems to be relentlessly negative and relentlessly depressing. Because on top of all the concerns we hear, we've been told to be concerned about climate migrants, small island states disappearing under rising water. I've talked about the wildlife, concerns about pests and diseases. On top of that, I'm going to say that climate change is already harming the population around the world. It's already harming especially the elderly, the vulnerable, and we're putting at risk the health of the next generation, our children, our friends' children. And quite possibly, I'm starting to notice in the news now that messages are coming up about how climate change is harming our health. So you might have been sensitized a little bit to that recently. But I also want to present a somewhat positive message. And what I'm going to talk about, and the more positive message will be towards the end of the talk, but what I want to talk about is, and just to say that there is actually plenty that we can do at the individual level, at the country level, and at the global level that will improve our health, and in the process improve the health of the planet. I'm not going to say it's easy, but I will talk about what we can do. I'm just going to grab some water. And again, still before I start the talk proper about climate change and health, what I just want to say as well is that I want to make clear that all the data I show and anything I talk about is about what's happening now and how things have changed relative to 10, 20, 30 years ago. So I'm not going to show you predictions about the future. I'm not going to talk about projections into the future. I'm not going to talk about what a world in 2050 might look like or a world in 2100 might look like. And so that's a little bit different from sometimes when we hear people talking about climate change, we're talking about future projections. And there's a lot of uncertainty about what the future is going to look like. If we don't do anything, it's going to look pretty bad, but there's a lot of uncertainty about how bad it's going to be. So what I want to say is that what climate change impacts we're seeing on health, we can see already, but there's also positive things we can do that can have a relatively immediate impact. So that's most of the preamble, I think. So now I'm going to show you lots of words on a slide and a schematic. I'm going to try and talk through this schematic. So I want to talk first of all about how climate change and health are linked. And so I'll just talk through this. And this is a simple schematic. It's just some of the links between climate change and health. And you might already be thinking it's just not that simple. And that's great if you're thinking that, because we'll talk about why it's not, but why it might be helpful to have something a little bit simple. So on the left-hand side, we've got all the usual suspects when we think about what's causing climate change, what's leading to all those emissions. So we can think about industry, we can think about deforestation, we can think about agriculture, we can think about transport. And then as we move from left to right, we can start to think about what this leads to. So when we have these emissions, what's happening to the planet? Well, we're seeing raised average temperatures across the planet. Excuse me. We're seeing increases in extreme temperatures. We're seeing more heat waves, more frequent, more extreme. And we're seeing altered rainfall patterns. So moving more again to the right, what's the impact of that? So we're seeing more floods. We're also seeing more droughts. We're seeing more wildfires. And we're seeing an increased geographical spread of disease-carrying organisms. What do I mean by that? We're finding mosquitoes carrying dengue and malaria in countries that didn't used to have to worry about those diseases because those kind of malaria, those kind of mosquitoes couldn't survive there. What do we see as a consequence of the floods? Well, we're going to see far more spread of bacterial diarrhea. What are we going to see as a consequence of droughts? Well, one of the consequences, reduced crop outputs, which can lead to undernutrition. What are we going to see from the consequences of wildfires? Increased particulate pollution leading to respiratory disease, and a direct impact from heat waves to cardiovascular harm. And another thing that I've sort of put on the right-hand side on it, spreading across all those, because a lot of these impacts of climate change and health are increasingly being shown to have a detrimental effect on our mental health. And I'll talk about that in a little more detail. Now, you might, or might not, but you might be thinking, well, okay, we can make those links, but actually do we really see these poor health outcomes as a function of climate change? You might think, if we live in a richer country, we have public health systems, and they're there to try and mitigate these problems. So if we think there's going to be more chance of having these bad health outcomes, let's put some more money into our public health service to try and improve our health. We might think about Singapore. Singapore is an area where you should get malaria, but Singapore has managed to eliminate that. And it did it basically by eliminating any areas of stagnant water where malarial mosquitoes breed. It's much harder to get rid of dengue. Dengue is not quite as dangerous. It doesn't kill so many people, but it's harder to get rid of. And so governments can take action, and we can think about that as adaptation. We can adapt to climate change. You might also say, okay, I see all those health outcomes, but really there's lots of other reasons why we have cardiovascular problems. There's lots of other reasons why we have respiratory disease. And certainly I work a lot on food and nutrition, and there's an awful lot of other reasons why we find undernutrition. And if you know anything about food security, you know that it's not just about is there enough food, it's about can people afford it? How expensive is the food? Is it in the right place at the right time? And so another problem we have is attribution. I can show you a pathway, but if we see an increase in any of these diseases and ill health, can we attribute that through to climate change? And so we can find very sophisticated econometricians who can take individual aspects of this and with sophisticated data, work back to what extent we can attribute to climate change. But we don't necessarily need to do that to present an important message to policymakers. Because why do we want to show these links between climate change and health? One of those reasons is we want to give policymakers the much needed data to inform policy decisions, to make better, more informed policy decisions. So if we look on the left-hand side of this diagram, we can think of these as exposure metrics. So we can start saying, okay, are people around the planet being more exposed to aspects of climate change that are going to lead to ill health? And on the right-hand side, we can think of those as outcome indicators. So we can start saying, are these outcomes of ill health getting worse or better? And then we can start to ask ourselves, if a health outcome is getting worse, is that because of climate change, poor public health services, or something else? So let's talk about heat. I'm just going to talk about a few of these aspects. And I'll just give you some sort of data. So in 2003, 70,000 people in Europe died because of the heat wave. These are rich countries with good public health services. Sometimes it's hard to relate to that in the UK, because it's often cold and wet and miserable, but we've had heat waves here. And I think some of us might grumble. Our kids might say, let's go to the beach. But if it's hot, we go inside. We put on the air conditioning if we have it, which most of us don't, but we could buy if we needed it, or we put on a fan. And yet, so many people are still dying from heat waves in a high-income country. But since 2015, France has had continuing heat waves and deaths, 500 to 3,500 every year since 2015. In 2019, that's this year, France experienced record temperatures. And yet, I don't want to say only, but 1,500 people died, rather than the 15,000 who died in 2003. So to some extent, we can say France has learned to adapt. And after the extreme deaths in 2003, it took lots of actions to try and reduce those deaths. There was a nationwide alert system. There were cooling systems introduced. Every nursing home had to have at least one air-conditioned room. But if you're someone living with a disability, maybe you can't make it in time to one of those cooling rooms. If you're homeless, maybe you don't even hear the early warnings. So even if we take these actions, there are still going to be some people, and it tends to be those who are already the most vulnerable, who are going to be harmed by climate change. If you live in a low and middle income country, it's going to be even harder to deal with heat waves. And of course, one answer to that is, well, it helps to get richer. And so we might think, what should we focus on? Should we focus on helping lower income countries get richer so they can cope with climate change? We're not going to want to not do that anyway. Or should we actually be trying to deal with climate change? But at some point, the heat is so extreme that the human body is pushed to its limits. And the magic number is 35 degrees centigrade. So when your body, I'm not a medical doctor, but this much I know, above 35 degrees, your body requires evaporation of water to keep the core at a safe level. So what do we say? We've got to be able to sweat if it's above 35 degrees, basically. And if we can't sweat, we can't cool down our body. And so what that means is when it's over 35 degrees and when there's sufficient humidity in the air, it is physically impossible to cool your body down unless you get out of the heat. If we can't avoid the heat, we die. It doesn't matter rich or poor. And already there may be isolated incidences where it's simply too hot to be outside. And so we can think to ourselves, okay, but even if it gets hot, even if countries are poor, they can get richer, we can put in air conditioning, we can find fans. And so, okay, so let's say it's above 35 degrees C, and we've got an air-conditioned room when we go into that room. When it's hot, everyone else is hot. So everyone goes into their rooms, everyone puts the air conditioning on. There's a huge surge of power demand. When is the most likely time to have a power outage? When there's a huge surge. And so we get a huge surge of demand of power outage, we can't escape from the heat. So at some point, we can't adapt. And we know we've experienced 35 degrees is not that hot. And in some parts of the world, in some parts already, there's isolated spaces where it's that hot and that humid that actually it's not possible to be outside. Wildfires. Parveen mentioned wildfires. We've heard about wildfires recently in the Amazon. There's wildfires frequently in Australia that we hear about. Western United States has been experiencing wildfires. Fires kill directly. They're more frequent in an era of climate change because we're getting these more extreme droughts. If fire doesn't kill directly, it has all kinds of negative health effects. So when we get the smoke, that leads to air pollutants. We think about particulate matter, carbon monoxide. What does it do to us and our bodies? We're going to cough more. We're going to find shortness of breath. We're going to have increased risk of more severe asthma attacks. Again, the vulnerable more harmed. Anyone with a pre-existing respiratory or cardiovascular problem, it's going to worsen if they're exposed to wildfire smoke. Again, it's children and the elderly who are the most vulnerable. And public health services can be overwhelmed. And we see this in high-income countries. After the hurricanes that went through New Orleans, hurricanes happen without climate change, but they're more severe when there's climate change. And when the hurricanes moved through the United States, even the health systems there got overwhelmed. So again, we can try to adapt, but already high-income countries are finding that hard. Researchers found out that people with mental health problems are particularly at risk of exposure to heat. And so during wildfires, what we find happens, well, wildfires, often we might lose our house, we might lose our pets. There's documented evidence people will suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. They'll experience more depression, more anxiety, and more suicidal thoughts. There's data that shows that when there's a heat wave, there's an increased incidence of suicide. There's also data that shows that when it gets hotter, there's more violence in prisons. So there's lots of these links between heat and poor health and poor outcomes. I can tell lots of stories, and I can tell lots of anecdotes that link climate change, that link weather, and that link health. But maybe they're just anecdotes. We've always had wildfires, we've always had droughts and floods, and way back in biblical stories and historical records, there have been droughts, if we look back 3,500, 4,000 years to Egypt. But what I haven't demonstrated yet is whether climate change is making the health problems worse, and therefore whether climate change is putting increased pressure on our healthcare systems. And stories and anecdotes are not sufficient for policymakers. They want data, and they want to be able to make informed decisions. And so if we can put data to some of these anecdotes, if we can link the data to the schematic I showed you, maybe we can provide yet more evidence for why it's so important to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So I'll show you one approach to how this can be done. And this is the work that I've been doing with the Lancet Countdown, which is a Wellcome Trust-funded project, so explicitly looking at the links between climate change and health. And it was started originally by a group of medical doctors who felt that this topic just wasn't being taken seriously enough. So, back to heat. Heat, back to heat. So this is one graph I want to show you. And what this shows, there's not many data points on it, but behind each of these data points, there's an awful lot of work goes into each of these data points. But I'll try and talk through what this graph means. So the graph plots data from 2000 to 2006. And the yellowy orange line shows the fact that the land surface area has been warming. Not at a steady rate. The lines bounce up and down. But we can see, even over 18 years, there's been steady warming across the globe. Now, if we care about health of our populations, we don't just care about warming, we care about warming where people live. So the blue line plots a population-weighted warming. And here we can see that actually where people live is where it's getting hot faster. And so these data suggest that we need to be concerned, one, because there is some climate change and some climate warming, that we can pick that up over a span of just 20 years. And two, people are living in those hotter places. And why? Well, partly that's because more populations are living in cities, and in cities we get an urban heat effect. So if you think about it, in the daytime, the concrete and the tarmac warms up, and at night it cools down much more slowly. And I live in London, so I certainly know that it can feel quite mild when I leave home for work, and I can get to Reading, there's a thick frost. So it's very obvious, the urban heat effect, if you live in a city and you work outside of such a big city. These are data for heat wave, so it's a similar idea that we plot the recent past average of heat waves, and then we look at what's happening globally. These data are done slightly differently. In this case, it's looking at heat wave exposures. So the data is saying how many people each year are being exposed to a day of heat wave. So if I experienced 5 days of heat wave in the UK, that would be 5 of those 50 or 100 million years. And again, this has changed relative to recent past. And of course, the numbers bounce up and down, but on average, the numbers seem to be going up. So we can see a similar pattern. These are global data, there's a clear upward trend. And these are heat waves. The heat waves are affecting, again, particularly the elderly, those with pre-existing conditions. So one of the messages from this, And I've only shown you heat and heat waves, so I haven't actually shown you the link to health, because as I say, getting the attribution is really hard. But one of the messages we can get from this is because we can show a pathway through to bad health, the clear message is that public health sectors are already needing to work much harder to deal with climate-related health problems. And that means we're spending money on climate-related health problems that could be spent treating other illnesses and diseases. I'm going to talk about food and nutrition a little bit. As Parveen said, I work in a School of Agriculture, Policy and Development. So I'll talk a little bit about food and nutrition. So this is a very simple graph, and these are very simple data. This is per capita food supply, and these data come straight off, if you know, FAO stat. It's an FAO website. And so this just plots all the way back from 1962 to, you can't really get data, it seems, at the moment above about 2014, but global daily per capita food supply. So this takes into account that there's been population growth in the world, and what we can see is there's more food available per person in the world than there ever has been. And so it suggests that, well, we don't really need to worry about food. We're producing more food. I'm going to show you four graphs to link to food supply. The second one is global undernutrition. I found this quite interesting when I plotted this graph. I wasn't sure what I was going to see. But if we look from about 2002, 2004, the total number globally undernourished has been falling until the last couple of years when it's just creeping up a bit. Now, there could be many reasons for that. It could be conflict. It could be poverty. It could or could not be climate change. But already we can see that just because there's enough food doesn't mean that, just because food supply is going up doesn't mean that nutrition is going to fall. So already we can see it's the attribution problems. It's going to be complicated telling the story. So how can we link this to climate change? I'm going to show you a graph that's produced by a colleague of mine in meteorology, Professor Nigel Arnell. Now, anytime I try to explain what accumulated thermal time is, I get all tongue-tied, and it's really difficult. So I chatted with our events people, and they said, just don't try to explain it, but if someone wants to know, you can talk about it another time. The point of this graph says that since 1960, crop yield potential has been falling. And accumulated thermal time basically means that as it gets hotter, plants mature more rapidly, and they don't have time to absorb water, they don't have time to absorb sunlight to produce the yields, to produce biomass, to fill out the grains. And why is this a worrying graph? Because in a way, we can think of it as an early warning system. It's a leading indicator for governments. So we can see that there's enough food in the world. We can see that undernutrition's been falling, okay, there's a blip up. But here what we're saying is, however much we deal with all the other problems about food supply and nutrition and people having access to food, yield potential is falling. I'm going to show you data from one crop and one country, because sometimes, I'll show you in a minute how, very simply, I'll show you how these data, how we get these kind of data. But I've shown you this is aggregated across many crops, across many countries. Well, this is maize, but across many countries. We could aggregate it across many crops. So I'll show you one country, and I'll tell you a story. So this is Australia, and these are Australian wheat yields from 1960 to 2014. This is a very simple graph. The only thing I've plotted is yields. So I'm going to tell you a story, but the reason that I'm confident about the story is I've read all the literature. So a lot of scientists have been thinking really hard about why yields go up. And so if we look from 1960 to about 1990, we know several reasons why yields increase. We could be using better management. We could have better seeds. We could be managing water better. We could be using more fertilizer. We could be using better pesticides. Lots of reasons. But also, the scientists have looked really detailed, and yields went up as well because of climate change. So plants, like some of us, like to be warmer. So when it gets warmer, they're happier. As many of us know, plants like carbon dioxide, and with climate change, we get increased what's called carbon fertilization. So over that time, actually, the increasing warmth and the increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was a positive thing for wheat in Australia. And even now we can find some crops in some parts of the world are actually happier now that there's a bit of climate change, a bit of extra warmth and a bit more carbon dioxide. But what we can see is yields have started to stall, and they started to stall in about 1990s, 2000s. And again, you need to read a lot of the literature to ask why. But part of that reason is that it's now too hot. So just like for people again, when it gets too hot, we're not happy. When it gets too hot, the plants aren't happy either. And there's two things we can pick up from this. One, yields have actually leveled off. And two, we're starting to see several examples of quite extreme harvest shocks, where harvest plummets due to droughts and fires. And if any of you have read about the 2008 food crisis, and if you're in my master's class, you might hear about that in a couple of weeks in painful detail, you'll have heard about the 2008 food crisis. And one of the things that happened in the 2008 food crisis is a bit of an anecdote, but there was a regime change in Haiti, halfway around the world from Australia. And the prime minister was overthrown, and basically because the price of food was so high. And that was triggered by these harvest shocks in Australia, because Australia is absolutely essential for wheat exports. Okay, so I will just talk a tiny bit about how you create a global indicator. If any of you were at Professor Ed Hawkins' talk, he would have shown you some really beautiful graphics. I'm not, I'm an economist. I'm going to show you some very simple graphics. So this is how I understand it, the simple way. We take the planet and we grid it. And so we create a grid around it, and we create thousands and thousands of little polygons. And each of those polygons we look down on, and conceptually think about this, we measure the temperature. And we simply measure the temperature every year, and we see if it's changed or not. And then we add up all those temperature changes across the whole globe, across every polygon. Because we're interested in human health, we might also, I just went the wrong way. Because we're not using my clicker. Because we're interested in human health, we might also look at how population density has changed in each of those little polygons. And as an agriculture and resource economist, I would also look at what crops are grown there and what's happening to those crop yields, or how are those crops affected by those changes in temperature, maybe humidity, other aspects. So far, I've talked to you about the links between climate change and health, some of those really bad health outcomes when it gets too hot or when there's too many wildfires, and how we can create some of these global indicators to say to policymakers that there are real effects for our health now. More and more people are being exposed. We're putting more and more pressure on our health service. But what does that mean for a country like the UK? Right? I've shown you global indicators. Even with evidence, what we do know is that there's a lot of reluctance at the national level to actually do anything, or at least do anything in more than a superficial way. And now for the next 5 minutes, I'm going into econ lecture mode, so that's a warning for you guys. But the problem of climate change is a problem of a global, climate change mitigation, reducing climate change, is a global public good. And the problem there is that if an individual country reduces its emissions, it incurs some costs for that, and the benefits accrue to the world. That's very altruistic and very generous, but it makes it very easy for countries to go, well, you're not doing anything, so I'm not going to do anything. Or for a country to go, we really want to reduce our emissions, but we need to reduce our poverty too. Or we know we should reduce our emissions, but you emit more than we do. So when you start reducing your emissions, we will. So it's very easy to just keep pointing your finger and finding excuses not to act. And the problem is that globally, we would all be better off if we all reduced our emissions, but individually, we're better off not to reduce our emissions. That's game theory, my favorite topic. So what I did was I snuck in a slide. And so this is your 5-minute economics lesson. And your homework is to figure out what the analogy is with climate change. But I'll probably say what the analogy is. So I want you to think, I've been allowed about 5 minutes to do this. I want you to think about going to work. And so this is the thought experiment. You can either take the bus or you can drive. And this is all of us in this room. We're all going to work in the same city. And so we're all making that choice. Do I take the bus or do I drive? So when I make that choice, I'm going to think about what you guys are doing. And if you guys are all taking the bus, right? There's going to be very few cars on the road. But the bus will have to stop to pick you all up from the various stops and have to stop again to drop you. So if you're going to take the bus, all of a sudden all the cars are off the road. I'm going to drive. I'm going to drive by and sort of wave at you in the bus and laugh because I'm driving to work fast and you're stuck on the bus. Let's see. What am I going to do if everyone else drives? Okay, well, if everyone else drives, there's quite a lot of traffic on the road. Well, I'm going to drive also, right? Because if I take the bus, when you're all driving, I'm going to be stuck in traffic and the bus is going to keep stopping at all those other stops. So whether you take the bus or whether you drive, it's always in my interest to drive. And I just put some numbers there that sort of make some intuition. If we all take the bus, it takes us 30 minutes to get to work. If you all take the bus but I drive, I can sneak past and get there in 15 minutes. If we all drive, there's tons of traffic. It takes us all 60 minutes. And if you're all driving and I take the bus, there's loads of traffic and I'm stuck on the bus. It takes me 90 minutes. So my dominant strategy is to drive. Your dominant strategy is to drive. We all drive. But if we all took the bus, we'd all be better off. We'd get to work in, how long? 30 minutes. But if you're all taking the bus, I'm going to drive. So we get this lose-lose situation for individual countries and the global population. And that's our analogy with climate change and why it's so hard to get countries to act. So, is this where we just give up and go home? No, this is where we go to China. So, 4 years ago, I took my daughters on sabbatical to China, to Beijing University. This was sometimes what it looked like when we looked outside of our apartment. The air was frequently highly polluted. So what do we know about air pollution? Firstly, much of the air pollution comes from either coal burning in houses or in factories, and it comes from people driving petrol and diesel cars, all of which contributes to global warming. Second, we know that air pollution is bad for our health. 7 million deaths each year due to air pollution. A third of fatalities from strokes, lung cancer, and disease due to air pollution. 90% of children across the globe are breathing toxic air every day, air pollution. Between 2010 and 2016, air pollution concentrations worsened in 70% of cities around the world. All very depressing. But sometimes, and in fact, when we arrived in Beijing, this is what it looked like. Beautiful city, clean air, no pollution. Now, in Beijing, when the wind blows, the pollution goes away. But in this case, there was no wind. And so we were thinking to ourselves, there's no pollution. Why was everyone sort of warning us about taking air masks to Beijing? It's a beautiful place. So what happened? So it was very simple. The government decided that it was celebrating a big anniversary in September, and it decided if it was going to celebrate an anniversary, it wanted clear skies. How do you get clear skies? It's actually very simple. You shut down all heavy industry around Beijing, you stop 80% of cars driving in Beijing, and you stop people in their houses from burning coal. So it's really simple. If we want to, we can make a choice to have clean air. Now, of course, that's costly. People who will work in the factories, they have no job for 2 months while they're closed down. Some people, of course, are going to find it much easier to go to work if they're allowed to drive. People who aren't allowed to drive are going to have to pile onto the public transport and find it even harder to go to work. But there is a point to this. The point to this is that governments make choices, and not acting is also a choice. And we have to remember that there are choices that can be made. Every day, we as individuals and governments are making choices, and we're making choices that harm our health and our planet. But conversely, we can make choices that don't harm our health and benefit our planet too. But it's really difficult. So why are we not making those choices? And I'll just talk a little bit about why it's difficult. So we'll talk bicycles. So I'm going to talk about 3 things that we can improve our health at a country level, and we don't have to worry about what anyone else in the world is doing, because we can do things that will directly benefit people in our country. And, as a co-benefit, as a win-win, we can help the planet too by reducing our emissions. Lack of physical exercise is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. So if you're less active and you're less fit, you're at greater risk of developing high blood pressure. So getting fitter with, this is my jargon alert, active transport. I didn't know what that was. I'm like, what is active transport? Until a few years ago. It just means walking or bicycling, basically. So if you walk or if you cycle, it's a way to get fitter. So why don't we do it? Many reasons. Let's think about it. Am I going to let my kids cycle on the roads? I might, but I feel it's a bit dangerous. I feel they could be knocked off by a car. I feel they're going to be breathing in even more fumes. Though a colleague tells me, actually, you breathe in more fumes if you're in your car. But I don't know that. I feel like you're breathing more in if you're on your bicycle. Roads are crowded. So I feel like I'd be risking my kids' health, both physically from being knocked over and through sort of what they're breathing. And what if I say take public transport? It's unreliable. They still have to walk there. Maybe it's not so safe walking there at night. They're still walking through that pollution. If you walk up Putney Hill, you're walking by the buses and you're breathing in all their fumes. 2014, you might have heard about this in the news. A young girl, 14 when you were a young girl, died of acute respiratory failure and severe asthma. And one of the causes of that, she already suffered from asthma, so she was one of these vulnerable people with a pre-existing condition. And one of the reasons for this was found to be unlawful levels of pollution contributed to her death. And this was in London. This was not this is not like the picture of Beijing that I showed you. This was London. So we have to ask ourselves, how many of our children are breathing polluted air every day they go to school? So what might seem like an individual choice, I'm going to cycle, I'm going to be more active, we realize it's not that easy. We actually need governments to help. Governments need to facilitate. And what might they do? I say this every time in the hope they might listen here in Reading. I'm like, what about free public transport for under 18s? So when you're thinking of taking your child to school, quite often for some people it's actually cheaper to drive your child to school than have them pay for public transport. If you're paying for 2 or 3 children to pay for the bus to go to school and back. Children can do something as well. You know, what could they do? Well, how about checking the air pollution in your street where your school is? Showing it to your parents, showing it to your teachers, and say, every time you drive down there to drop me off, you're contributing to this. These are data I just found on the internet. They're very easy to find, these kind of data. This is PM10 readings in Reading. PM10 is particulate matter of 10. I'm going to get it wrong whether it's microns or mucrons, but someone can correct me somewhere. But whenever we breathe PM2.5s or PM10s, these particulate matters, these are the ones that get deep down into our lungs and cause us long-term health problems. So there's scope for increasing air quality. There's ways to do it. Technologically, it's not that hard, but politically, it's a bit harder, because it means making choices, and costly choices in some cases. But you make those costly choices, you improve health, you take the pressure off public health services. When we consider air quality, it's local governments that we need to act. There are some areas that we can do to sort of have some impact as individuals. Cows. So it's always a little difficult talking about this when you work in a School of Agriculture, Policy of Development, and when your school and when your university owns a farm with a dairy herd, but I will talk about cows. So there's a general consensus that the long-term consumption of increasing amounts of red meat, particularly processed red meat, is associated with increased risk of total mortality, increased risk of cardiovascular disease, increased risk of colorectal cancer, and type 2 diabetes. I know there's been an article out recently that's in the newspapers saying that actually there isn't such a strong link, but despite that article, a lot of scientists still say there is quite a strong link, and it's in both men and women. So many of us could reduce our consumption of red meat, certainly without harming our health. And now I'm talking about higher income countries. In some lower income countries, people are actually short of protein. So I'm talking about here, if we actually look at how much animal protein we consume, we could halve our consumption of protein, improve our health, and quite seriously, sort of benefit the planet. Because where we have cows belch methane. Methane is a particularly problematic greenhouse gas. If we're going to eat meat or consume dairy, there are better ways of doing it. So, for example, we can choose grass-fed cows rather than cows that are fattened with soy, because we have to think where the soy comes from. Often it comes from countries that are clearing forests to grow that soy for us to eat beef. So grass is a better choice. So this is a choice we can make with a little concern over what the role of government is. But it's a hard one for individuals to choose. And so again, we do have to think a little bit that maybe government has some responsibility to create that environment, that food environment, that helps nudge us and push us towards a more plant-based diet, which is healthy for us, healthy for the planet. I'm going to go back now to this schematic I showed. Now we all know what global public goods are and why it's so difficult to deal with. So the original schematic, the problem there is all these emissions that I show, industry, deforestation, agriculture, transport, all these impacts in terms of impacts on temperature, rainfall, heat waves. These are global problems. It doesn't matter who's producing the greenhouse gas emissions. The impacts in terms of temperature, weather, are felt all around the globe. So yes, there are efforts to try and reduce emissions, of course, at a global level because it's the right thing to do. And that's why every year countries come together at the climate change COP, the Conference of Parties, and countries come together and try to say, yes, we will commit to, together, slowly but surely reducing our emissions. Life would be much easier if there were a global dictator, because then the global dictator could just tell us all to reduce our emissions. It's really hard, the fact we have individual nation states. Democracy makes any of this kind of stuff hard. But it's the fact we don't have a global dictator makes it particularly hard. But that's probably not a bad thing that we don't have one. But we've got to accept that it's hard. So that is a tough job, and there's a lot of people trying to deal with that. And that's why, like I say, these climate change meetings happen. And that's why individuals feel that, they want to take some responsibility and do their bit. But if we follow the green pathways a little bit, these are pathways where there are win-wins at a country level. So we can add these pathways and start talking about at a country level. We can improve health, that reduces our health budget, healthier population, happier population, and at the same time, we can have quite a significant impact on global emissions. And it's a starting point. I still think as a rich country, somewhere like the UK has a moral responsibility to reduce its emissions. But sometimes it's just easier to start with this will be good for the UK than the moral responsibility when we're trying to persuade. So that's it, almost. Take-home message. So we started by picturing what the climate crisis looked like. Some of us closed our eyes to have a mental picture. Now I'm going to ask you what future you want to bequeath to the next generation and what we want that to look like. We have to visualize that future first, and we have to think about what it looks like, and we have to think about what we want it to look like. I've given you lots of very depressing mental images. And if you start thinking about the future and climate change, everyone's giving us really depressing mental images. What the planet will look like in 2050 if we're on a 4-degree trajectory. What it's going to look like in 2100. What's going to happen when we get an overturning of the AMOC. What's going to happen when the polar ice sheets completely melt. And all that white that's reflecting heat back turns to black rock and starts to absorb more heat. Very depressing messages. So let's try and have a positive message. And this I think, is the positive message, that if we want to give the next generation around the globe healthier lives, if we want to give them the chance to breathe clean air, if we want to give them a chance to use public transport, to walk and feel safe, to cycle where they want to, what we're also visualizing is a much more equitable society. And so that's got to be a good thing. And so we need to lobby governments to focus on these public goods that reduce inequalities in countries. It's got to make sense to reduce emissions for clean air. And this goes a little away from health, but it's got to make sense to improve insulation in people's homes. If we can improve insulation in people's homes, we can reduce their energy bills. Again, it reduces inequality. So if we can have a mental image of what the future looks like, let's think about the future we would like to create and bequeath to the next generation. And I think talking about climate change and health maybe can help with that. So I'm going to say thank you so much for listening to me talk. And that so many people make these presentations happen. These are the people I had most interaction with who helped make this happen. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Liz, for such a thought-provoking lecture, which brings the challenges we face into such sharp focus. I'm sure there are lots of questions. There are some roving microphones, so please wait until you have a microphone before you ask your question. Yes, at the back.
Yeah, hi. So you mentioned about reducing emissions will make a more equitable society, but for example, with giving free bus passes to youth, surely the wealthier in society will just drive their kids to school because they can afford the extra cost, and they save the time. Like in the conundrum you mentioned, they save the time, they're better advantaged in work, and the less well off. They have less time at work, and then that would increase the inequality in society. How can changes like this be made without increasing that social divide?
Wow, that's a fantastic question. Thank you. So we often find that whenever we do something, people who are better off can buy their way out of it some way. So even if we put carbon taxes on, and economists are busy signing letters saying we should just put carbon taxes on, but we know the wealthy will just pay them. And carry on, if I want to fly somewhere and I can afford the carbon tax, I'll keep flying. So I think you're right, and I'm so glad you linked it back to that slide. So you've caught an issue there, and maybe then we have to combine it with a ban. So maybe we just say we can't just price things and say, let's make it cheaper to go to school. But maybe we say, actually, and some schools are doing this, we ban any cars from driving down this street during school hours. And so there, I suppose, we're trying to make a system where you can't just buy your way out and get your, and you're right, you get an even more extreme advantage because you get the clear roads. And we saw that happen, I think, with the congestion charge in London. Because when the congestion charge came in, I suspect there was plenty of people who wouldn't have driven in before because it was so congested. But afterwards, they were like, you know, my time is worth a lot. So if I only have to pay 10 quid and now I can drive in when there's no congestion, I'll drive in. So we would have got the benefits of lower congestion, but there would be some people who were already better off, who'd be even better off, because now they would choose to drive in and the £10 meant nothing to them. So I suspect we've got to combine carrots and sticks. So the carrots that we invest in, say, public transport, which benefits all, but the sticks that say one doesn't want to punish people who've been successful in life, but at the same time, we don't want to create a system which then allows them to do even better than they were doing before. Yeah, fantastic question. Thank you.
Over here first.
I'm going to have to tell everyone they're a fantastic question now, otherwise people are going to be rating themselves against the questions, not the answers.
So his question actually leads into mine because the predominant issue then becomes an infrastructure one. If you're in communities that are so tight, and coming from the US, y'all's communities are tight, how do you build in things like when the Dutch created the road systems, they built in bicycle lanes. But if you go to countries that wasn't a social construct, like you walk to France and their bicycle lanes are a death trap because people park on them and on the sidewalk and a bunch of other places, but they're not built into a social structure, and the infrastructure design for going into the smaller villages or the more rural communities, how do you get around that? Because that is such a large part of a community's budget then. If we came here to Reading, for example, and you wanted to build in bike lanes to your roads, there's no way you have a house on the edge of the road. So how do you get around that? I'm going to give you a big old question, sorry.
I love that question because to some extent, and this is because I'm an economist, I try to simplify everything down. But actually, like you say, the real world is much more complex. To start with, I honestly don't know. But I think these are some of the real challenges. I think you're right. And it may be in some areas you just can't. Or society decides, that local community decides it's just too expensive to do. And that's where, you know, ultimately there's a budget and you have to prioritize. And so I didn't show up a load of numbers of, you know, what is a life worth and what is someone's health worth? Because, you know, ultimately that's what we're kind of doing. Do we spend on healthcare? Do we spend on bicycle lanes? Do we spend on, you know, reducing poverty? So it's not simple, I think you're right. And retrofitting into society and changing the culture of society is also really hard. But I sometimes think that we've sort of spiraled into this. We've sort of spiraled into this problematic equilibrium where we all just eat packaged food and jump into our cars, and we don't really think that hard about the fact that actually maybe these are not the best choices we're making for ourselves. And then at societies level, it's probably the same as well, that we're not making those difficult decisions. So probably we make those choices where we can, and we look where it's possible. And so it may be actually that trains are more important, and that if we can't put those bicycle lanes in, we put in electric minibuses, or we pedestrianize. So one option is simply to pedestrianize. That might be. But then, you know, if there are people who bought a house assuming that they would drive to their work and then suddenly their road is pedestrianized, what are they going to do? So you've raised a really good point that it's really not simple. And there's a lot of embedded cultural norms and embedded infrastructure that makes it even harder.
There was a question here, I think, possibly.
I was going to ask a very similar question, actually, about change in street furniture. But it seems to me that it is worth asking a little bit more about it, because there are some solutions, it seems to me, that are not that expensive and could be retrofitted, like this this green wave that there is in Copenhagen, where they, the green light is green all the way in to the city centre in the morning when people are going to work, and then out again in the evening, which I think is a brilliant solution. And presumably it's a change in the computer program that controls the traffic lights. Would not be too hard. So I don't know. It seems to me that would not be difficult, and it kind of needs a will, doesn't it, to change things. And we are actually, or society, our authorities and so forth are actually changing the street furniture all the time. And if there were a will to change it in such a way that it was more bike friendly, then we would perhaps move in the same sort of direction as Holland and Denmark. And of course, there are real solutions there that we can perhaps pick up on. So it's not really a question anymore.
It's a great comment. I think there's a really good point that if we look around the globe, there's lots of really creative solutions, and one doesn't necessarily have to come up with one's own. One looks at what's been implemented and why it works where. I was talking to my students. I always give sort of 3 examples of when I was a kid. Everyone smoked in the pub, and even though I didn't smoke, I kind of thought, well, you expect a pub to be smoky, and when you walked along, you always watched your feet so you didn't step in dog poo, and when you got in the car, there were no seatbelts in the back, and a lot of people resisted those changes, but once we'd resisted them, and once they'd been changed, actually most people went, oh, this is quite a nice lifestyle, I put my seatbelt on, I'm not getting secondary smoke if I'm working behind the bar, and I don't have to watch my feet for the dog poo. And so, although a lot of people resisted that afterwards, thought, oh, this is actually a nicer life. And it's like I'm not a chemist, but it's like when you've got this sort of, you've got to get over that bump, and you've got to put a little heat and energy to do the experiment, to get over that bump, to get into a better situation. And so it's getting over that bump that's quite hard. And that's the will, isn't it? It's the will to make the move to actually what is a better equilibrium. Sorry, this is when I get into lecture mode. You're here, you want to get there, but you actually have to go over that bump to get there. And that's the willpower, isn't it, to get over. It's hard.
Sorry, there is another question. Sorry. Which is, you did talk a little bit about, or you did have on your graph or your chart, mental health on the right-hand side. But it seems to me that there's the whole business of mental health is wider than what you showed, which is the sort of the physical things leading to poor mental health, because so if it's true that there is this sort of very rapid decline of the wild environment since 1970, 60% of wild animals have gone. That surely leads to a decline in mental health. I feel it does for myself. I don't know. It makes me sort of very depressed to think about. And I suppose maybe I don't know what I'm advocating for. Perhaps it isn't a question, but it's definitely a comment again. That there's this whole mental health thing, which is pretty wide and
I'm enjoying the conversation.
Scary.
You've just made me think of another win-win, which is planting more trees, more green spaces as people go from their homes to their work. We're sucking up carbon dioxide, and we could be improving mental health at the same time. So there's a lovely win-win. And you got another point. It's up to Parveen whether you're allowed to speak anymore, not me.
Just a really
Very
short
quick one,
which is that I didn't mow my lawn this past year, and it was great. It was a real success.
there's a question just a little bit further back there.
You suggested that moving to grass-fed meat will help to reduce emissions, but in the US, if everyone were to do that, it would use 3.7 billion acres, but the US only has 1.9 billion acres to do it, so it's not really viable. And obviously animal agriculture has been shown to be the leading cause of greenhouse gases and climate change. So what's your stance on moving to a plant-based food system?
Okay, so if you look at, I'm not an expert on this, but if we in this country are eating twice as much meat as is healthy for us, in America it's even more. So I think, and you're right, that if we want less intensive agriculture, it's going to take up more land, probably cutting more trees. I think we have to move to a more plant-based diet. I think, again, it's one of these, we've just got used to eating meat all the time. We've got used to eating tons of dairy, and we probably aren't going to be able to. And I get into trouble with butchers sometimes when I say we've got to eat less meat. I've had emails from them, but actually I've had a really good exchange, because if we're going to eat meat, I think we should eat it from high animal welfare sources, but we should eat less of it, which would probably mean we'd be using our butchers more and really caring about where the meat came from. But there's no doubt, if we're going to tackle climate change, people in higher income countries, those of us who are eating too much meat, have got to move to a more plant-based diet, meat and dairy, yeah. There's no alternative. But probably we'll feel healthier, and it's one of the things where we'll start eating less meat and not feel worse, actually probably feel better about it. Yeah, but it's hard to do. Yeah, good question.
Yeah,
Nice data too. I like your statistics.
further back up there.
So there's a related question about the integration of trees into agricultural systems. I just wonder if you have any views on this idea of silver pasturing and also integrating trees within crops.
If I dare answer any of that, there's going to be at least 20 people in the audience who know a whole amount more than I do. But all I can say is we have to plant more trees. We've been useless at it in the UK. We're way below our targets, which aren't ambitious enough as it is. And certainly one aspect could well be combining trees with a sort of I can't even spit the words out, but yes, I think we've got to do it. And one could even imagine, your livestock under the trees. So, rather than having intensive livestock, which has animal welfare implications, those animals could be under the trees and there could be crops nearby. Yeah. Sounds very Little House on the Prairie, doesn't it?
But I've heard that some companies are actually charging levies on flights that their staff take and using the money to plant trees to offset their carbon footprint, which, that's a really positive idea, isn't it? Right at the back there in the yellow shirt.
Liz, I'm glad you mentioned trees, and I'm glad someone mentioned agroforestry, but I'd like your view as an economist as to private landowners are not going to plant trees because of the long time lag before they get any reward. Mr. Gove and others are saying public money for public goods. So do you think society should be paying people to plant trees, not just farmers, but maybe the University of Reading or golf clubs or public parks, given that there are all sorts of advantages apart from greenhouse gas reduction from trees, like mental health aspects and so on? But I think it is a big public decision, rather than committees at either national or world level saying we must plant more trees. They haven't really thought it out. And there's also the question about deer that eat trees.
Okay, I know that Professor Trantrop there knows more than I do about this topic, and he promised he would heckle at some point. So this is a bigger picture, a sort of discussion of payment for ecosystem services. So you pay people to do things like plant trees to sequester the carbon. It's always quite difficult because often you find that a lot of people are going to plant trees anyway, and now we pay them to do what they were going to do anyhow. So you've got to be quite careful about this sort of concept of additionality. But to some extent, if you can try to structure so that the people who weren't going to plant trees are planting them, then it seems like a reasonable solution. Because always we're looking at how we spend our budget, aren't we? As a country, we pay our tax, and then the country decides how to spend it. How much it's going to spend on health, how much it's going to spend on defense, how much on poverty alleviation, and how much on climate change mitigation. And so one would really look and say, is that the most cost-effective way to reduce emissions? And if it is, why not? And then there's sophisticated ways you can do this by auctioning it. So if you want to sort of get people to reveal their willingness to be paid less to plant trees, you auction. And so you try to get away with paying as little as possible to people who are willing to plant trees. It's complicated. So one, it's complicated just in case people are going to plant trees anyway. And it's complicated because you've got to decide if that's the most cost-effective way to reduce emissions.
One final question.
Hi. All the pictures you painted at the beginning and throughout were about the negative effects of climate change on human health. And I'm not trying to gloss over that or negate it, but I just wonder whether there is any evidence anywhere that in some ways climate change is actually benefiting human health in some respects?
On aggregate, climate change is a disaster for human health. But yes, one could easily find isolated incidences where in very cold climates, people aren't as cold. So, you know, just like with the crops, some crops are happy if it's a bit warmer, some sadder. But what we know is climate change is only going in one direction. And even those people for whom it might be beneficial for a short while, it's only going to be a short while. And the other thing is that, so we could think of people who at the moment freeze in the winter. Again, the homeless, it's so cold, they freeze to death. But there's a relatively easy solution, which is to provide them somewhere warm to sleep. And if people are freezing in their homes, there's a relatively easy solution, which is to deal with fuel poverty. So those are solutions we can deal with. But when it comes to heat and on the other side, like I sort of said, there's nothing you can do as it gets hotter and hotter. And I've only talked about health, but I sort of already talked about the impact of hurricanes. And, you know, with global warming, the sea is warmer. So when you get a hurricane, more water is sucked up into the atmosphere. That slows the hurricane down. So there's far more water dumped on land when the hurricane meets the land. So we can always, if we disaggregate, we're always going to find some people who are going to benefit from climate warming. And quite honestly, in the UK, there was a headline in The Guardian, it really annoyed me. It said by 2050, the UK is going to have the climate of Barcelona. And probably most of us went, great, we're going to be I know it's not Mediterranean. We basically went, great, we're going to be Mediterranean. We don't have to fly to go on holiday. You know, we can go to Torquay and it'll be as warm as the Med. And so, yes, we're not going to be bothered. You know, our crops will move up a little bit. There'll be a slight change in what we grow. We might have more wine. But it's like, so we're not actually going to be that harmed. But so many other parts of the globe are. And I think that's the concern. On aggregate, it's going to be worse. And if we don't deal with it, it could become irreversibly worse because of the non-linearities in the system, yeah. But there will be some people who will benefit in the short and even the medium term, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, audience, for some great questions. Please join me in thanking Elizabeth once again for a great lecture.